Earlier today, Riot revealed yet another champion for the upcoming Legends of Runeterra expansion/launch. This time around it was another Bilgewater champion because that's the only region we have champion reveals left for, and it was Gangplank. Now, we did not get a new keyword with this reveal, but if you're familiar with Gangplank from League of Legends, one of the things that's pretty iconic to his kit is powder kegs. So naturally the champion has a powder keg mechanic that I think is pretty neat and interesting. We're going to put a graphic up that has all of the cards that were revealed today, but we're going to start by talking about Gangplank, and let's just dive right into it. So Gangplank is a 5-cost 5/5 from Bilgewater. It says, when I'm summoned, summon a powder keg, and we'll cover that in a second. But he also has Overwhelm. Now, Overwhelm is a great keyword for Gangplank to have because his level up condition is that you have to have damaged the enemy nexus in 5 rounds this game. So again, very akin to Sejuani in that regard. Powder Keg. Okay. Powder Keg is a 0-cost 0/1. It cannot attack, it cannot block, and it's vulnerable, so any enemy can essentially directly attack it. That's a lot of drawbacks. But that's because it's got a pretty powerful effect. Powder kegs stack, so if you would create more than one, they just stack on top of each other, and that's relevant because of our limited board size. If this was a game like Magic the Gathering where you could just create endless tokens, it wouldn't be a big deal, but given that you can only have so many units on the board at any one time, you can kind of get around that by stacking the powder kegs. And that's also, again, from a flavor standpoint, very neat because Gangplank can, in League of Legends, put down multiple barrels and kind of chain them together. So this is how they are reflecting that. And if you know anything about me, you know I love when flavor and function go together. So besides stacking, powder kegs say all your spells and skills deal 1 extra damage. Destroy me when your spell or skill damages enemies. So essentially you get like a one-time use of a Funsmith effect, and it's going to be getting that extra damage per powder keg. Again, they stack, so if you have like 3 powder kegs, then Get Excited would do 6 damage. If you've got 2 powder kegs, Withering Wail would deal 3 to every enemy. So you can kind of see why powder keg has so many drawbacks, because the effect is very powerful. Now, Funsmith Funsmith is a card that exists but has not seen much play because it's got a pretty lackluster stat line. Gangplank is like a Funsmith on steroids, but the aura is very, what do I want to say, brittle? Vulnerable? I mean, that's obviously got the vulnerable keyword, so maybe that's the right way to describe it. But essentially, the aura for Gangplank just has far more options for counterplay, because not only do you only get the 1 use from it, and you can attack the powder keg, thus negating the bonus, but if somebody puts a spell on the stack, for example, you know, they play Gangplank and then they play Withering Wail, trying to get a big boost of damage to the entire opposing board, right? While Withering Wail is on the stack, you could, in turn, like Vile Feast the powder keg, and then that would destroy the powder keg, and the Withering Wail would not get the bonus. Now, it's also very interesting to me that it says destroy it when your spell or skill damages enemies, because that means you can't have a powdered keg on the board and then just, you know, throw 4 spells on the stack, right? You can't go like Mystic Shot, Warning Shot, and then expect them all to get the bonus. It's a one-time use. I think that this is a very fair way to try to balance this ability, but make no mistake about it, like if you get the bonus from a powder keg on the right AoE ability, something like a Withering Wail, it's going to be a really powerful effect. Now, Gangplank does have a level 2, like all champions do, so when you do level him up, he gets the standard +1/+1 to his stats, keeps his Overwhelm keyword, but he picks up some new ways to generate kegs. So he says, when I'm summoned and round start, summon a powder keg, and then on attack, it's a skill, deal 1 damage to all enemies and the enemy nexus. So becomes very similar to Anivia, but because it's a skill, that means he would also consume any powder kegs on the board. So if the powder keg survives and you get this attack off, it's almost like a leveled up Anivia. Leveled up Gangplank is kind of serious business. I can very easily see this seeing a lot of play, because one of the drawbacks to Anivia always was that, yes, you could resurrect her and there's a bunch of neat tricks you can perform with her, but she costs 7 and it's only a 2-4 stat line. Gangplank, however, can help clear the way for your attackers with the skill, but also generate bonus damage through Overwhelm. Like, Gangplank is the proactive version of Anivia. What you sacrifice in, you know, resurrection tricks and fun revive combos, you gain in having a unit that just closes out games for you. Gangplank I could very easily see being the top end of a very aggressive deck, because in an aggressive list you would want to be damaging the enemy nexus each round anyways, and so you could very well likely find yourself either leveling him when you play him on 5, or maybe, you know, you play him and then the next turn he levels up. But it's entirely reasonable to imagine a scenario where that occurs, and that's a powerful unit. On 5, or even just for a 5 cost, getting, you know, a 5/5 or a 6/6 with Overwhelm that also boosts the damage spells or damage skills that you will assuredly be running. And keep in mind, it is skills, so not only is it Gangplank, but it's things like Boom Crew Rookie, for example, that it will also boost. Powder Keg has a lot of potential applications. I like Gangplank. I think Gangplank is definitely going to see some play in some proactive decks for sure. I think that he's a great top-end closer. He doesn't have the sheer raw like attack power of something like a Darius, but his stat line with Overwhelm and his ability to clear out potential blockers, get rid of those chump blockers, I just really think Gangplank has a lot of potential uses. I'm a fan. Now, other cards that were revealed. First up is Parlay, but it's Parlay. Army mateys, we ready to parlay. And I say that because it's got 3 R's. So when you go to search this card on card databases, you know, you're on Mobilytics, you're on LOR Guardian, whichever one you prefer, just remember that it's got 3 R's. It's not just normal parlay, it's parlay. So this is a 1-cost slow spell. Deal 1 damage to anything, but if it kills it, deal 1 damage to the enemy nexus. So this is a risk-reward version of Blade's Edge. What you sacrifice in terms of being able to use it as a combat trick, you gain in potentially, you know, doubling your damage by getting rid of a cheap unit and also dealing 1 damage to the enemy nexus. Now, why is this card relevant? Well, if you don't run a critical mass of 1-drops, this could be a great way to still just ping the enemy nexus on turn 1 if your game plan is to have a leveled up Gangplank when you hit round 5. This card is also great at triggering Plunder, which is a big mechanic in Bilgewater, and we're going to see yet another Plunder card in just a moment. I mean, you can already see it. I don't know why I'm saying see it, but we're going to talk about it in just a moment. But yeah, Parlay is great. Just like I said, Blade's Edge went up in value just from the existence of the Plunder mechanic. Parlay is right there with it, but the big drawback is obviously slow speed. So you cannot use it mid-combat. They get a lot of opportunities to potentially interrupt it, and if you really need that damage to the enemy nexus, but you get greedy and you try to kill a unit, and then they hit it with a buff of some kind, now, you know, you didn't kill a unit and you didn't get the damage on the nexus, so you don't trigger Plunder, you don't work towards leveling up Gangplank. So that's why I say it's like the risk-reward version of Blade's Edge. Now, depending on the deck, you could very well end up running both. But at least this exists in Bilgewater to kind of give you that opportunity, give you that tool. So I suspect in Plunder / proactive versions of Bilgewater that do not pair with Noxus, you might see Parlay show up. Now, next up we have Petty Officer. This is a 3-cost 3/1, and when you play it, you get a choice. You can summon a Powder Keg or a random 1-cost ally from any faction. Now, the any faction is relevant because I've talked about it in previous videos where sometimes when it says like summon a random X or create a random X, Legends of Runeterra tends to have a pseudo-random where it tries to pull from the regions that your deck is, but in this case it very explicitly says any faction, so you can get units that exist outside of the regions that you're playing. So just kind of keep that in mind when you make the choice. Obviously, this is pretty conditional. I think that this card has some potential. I really wish it was a 3-2, or even in many cases, I kind of wish this was a 2-2. The 1 health is, I don't know, a bit scary because you're also getting a 1-cost ally, and the chances of getting another 1 health thing is going to be pretty high if you choose that option. So being hit by something like Withering Wail in response to this is going to suck. But again, having that choice, I think, is nice. You can summon the Powder Keg if you're getting ready to set up something like a Mystic Shot or a Parlay. Obviously, Parlay goes way up in value with the presence of a Powder Keg as well, because it is going to deal significantly more damage. That's, again, part of that like risk-reward design of that card. So, I don't know. Petty Officer is neat. I think it's an interesting design. I think that it might shine the most in expeditions. I wouldn't be shocked if there's a deck that exists that run it, but when I see it, I'm not necessarily wowed either. Like, I'm not as impressed with this card as I was, say, the Demacian Scout that's a 4/1 for 4 that also makes a 4/4. Like, that card in terms of value seems bonkers and definitely makes up for the 1 health drawback. But when you compare this card to that card, you know, that's a 4-cost 4/1 that gets you a 4/4. This is a 3-cost 3/1 that also gets you, you know, if you high roll and you pull Jagged Butcher that we're going to look at next here, and you've plundered, then maybe you get a 3/3. But that's the high roll version. But your option to potentially choose a Powder Keg does also give you more flexibility. So I don't know. I'm just less impressed by this card as I am some of the others, but it's not necessarily bad either. So next up is Jagged Butcher, and I kind of just referenced it, but this is a 1-cost 2/2 with a plunder of grant me +1/+1. Now, if you're coming from the Elder Scrolls Legends, this card should look pretty familiar because there are a number of 1-drops that were similar, but they're towards the end of the game's supported lifespan. I know that technically you can still go play it right now, but it's just no longer being actively supported. But near the end of the actively supported lifespan, we got a card very similar to this. So this is, I think, going to be very, very good in proactive decks. People were already running Cytheria in certain Demacian lists anyway, and that was just a generic, you know, 1-cost 2/2. Being able to potentially play a 1-cost 3/3 on later turns. Like, I'm not even talking about the openers where, you know, you run Warning Shot, you hit that, and you get a turn 1 3/3. The reason that I think this card has some potential to be run, and why I suspect it will be in aggressive decks, is because 1-drops have a lot of value on turn 1, and then a lot of them start to fall off pretty hard in the later turns, right? You don't want to be top decking Hapless Aristocrat on turn 5, for example. Jagged Butcher in an aggressive deck is still fine in the later turns. It's not great, but it's still fine. If you top deck a 3/3 in later turns, like, you're okay with that. So I think that Jagged Butcher is certainly going to find a home in proactive decks. The real question, as always, will be whether or not aggro can survive, because it's been a very slow, very kind of controlling meta for a bit now, but I'm seeing a lot of tools to potentially prop up new aggressive archetypes. So that has me excited, but yeah, Jagged Butcher, just not flashy, just solid. So the last card is a 2/2 for 2. This is Dreadway Deckhand, and this says when I'm summoned, summon a Powder Keg. So I don't know if there's going to be some sort of deck where you very early on try to jam like 3 or 4 Powder Kegs onto the board and then go for some big splash. I think we're going to have to wait and see what other cards are revealed. but the tools are certainly there. I mean, you got a 2-drop that can give you a keg, you got a 3-drop that can give you a keg, and Gangplank can give you a keg. So, you know, if you bank a spell mana or 2 and you get to where you're playing Gangplank, and then on turn 5 you then try to set up like a 4 damage parlay, that could be cheeky. But my concern is the vulnerability of Powder Keg. Like, it's a 0/1 and it's vulnerable, so they can attack into it. It's really easy to disrupt. So trying to go for that kind of long-term payoff of summoning a Powder Keg over and over again across multiple turns and not taking immediate advantage of it feels a little weird. So it's hard for me to judge cards like Dreadway Deckhand and to some extent Petty Officer without really seeing the rest of the set, because it's ultimately going to come down to what are the best cards to use in conjunction with Powder Keg. Ultimately, I think that is the measuring stick for cards like Dreadway Deckhand. If Powder Keg is able to be reasonably used and have a powerful effect, then getting an understated card for like that cost will be fine, right? Like Dreadway Deckhand here, I'm gonna start calling him Dreadhand. I know my brain sometimes goes way faster than my mouth, and so for sure you'll hear me slip up and say Dreadhand very, very often. But Dreadway Deckhand here is just not great by itself. I mean, when you look at this, a 2/2 for 2 with 0 keywords is kind of awful. I mean, there's just no way around it. It's kind of awful. And so ultimately it just comes down to how powerful of an effect is Powder Keg going to be, and what tools are going to exist for you to take advantage of Powder Keg. And even in, let's just say there is a deck. Let's just say Powder Keg as an archetype is a thing. Even in a deck where you're doing that, you have to be in a position where you can take advantage of it at the right time and have those cards readily available. Cards like Parlay look really cool when you start thinking about, you know, stacking 3 Powder Kegs and then blowing something up and doing a lot of damage to the Nexus, but it's also a slow speed spell. If you're running any sort of Powder Keg archetype, you're almost assuredly going to need some fast speed options and maybe even burst speed options to ensure that if somebody does try to get rid of your Powder Kegs, whether that's via attacking or, you know, hitting them with a Vile Feast or whatever the case may be, you need a way to make sure that you're still getting value from them. Because if you're playing these cards that generate Powder Kegs and you're getting nothing in return, then you're just going to be way too far behind in games. Like, the value you sacrifice to create Powder Kegs, if you get no value from them, you're going to fall behind in terms of just overall tempo. So that to me is the measuring stick. Again, like, how do you take advantage of Powder Keg? What cards exist to allow you to take advantage of Powder Keg? And I guess we'll wait and see, right? There's still a bunch of stuff from the expansion we have not seen, though tomorrow, I don't know what time, but tomorrow we're supposed to get a full reveal. So essentially, everything that we haven't seen yet by the end of the day tomorrow should be available to us so that we can peruse them, start our theory crafting, get really excited, and then Tuesday is the big day. So I know all the advertising says April 30th, but again, if you've been playing on PC, and if you're watching this, chances are that's you, then our update comes on April 28th, and the reason they're saying April 30th is because they're also doing a mobile launch, but it takes up to 48 hours depending on the app store in the region for the mobile launch to propagate. So they're just trying to publicly share a date where if anybody on that day says, hey, I want to go try out Runeterra, it said it was out on the 30th, they'll load up an app store and it will be there for them. So that's why the advertising is the way that it is. So for us, Tuesday, April 28th, I'm really excited. I got a million things that I already want to try out, so I'm sure it'll be a very fun and interesting day. But that's it for this video. So if you made it this far, I appreciate you. Thanks, and until next time.